Dark legends often begin in whispers carried on the wind from frightened villages, but this one begins with screams swallowed by stone walls, screams that were never heard again. In the heart of a decaying kingdom where nobles dined on silver plates while peasants starved young girls began vanishing without a trace. They were promised comfort, promised work, promised safety. But what awaited them inside the looming castle was horror beyond imagining. Before we unravel the nightmare, let me remind you, if you dare to journey deeper into the shadows of history, hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss the darkness waiting ahead. The setting was deceptively beautiful, rolling hills of wheat swaying in the summer breeze, shepherds guiding their flocks under an endless sky, and children chasing one another along dirt paths. From afar, the castle on the hill seemed like a protector, a stone guardian rising proudly against the horizon. But inside those walls, the air was heavy with secrets. Servants never smiled. Torches flickered too long in the windows at night. The villagers told their children never to stray too close, but curiosity was a dangerous flame, and the lure of the castle burned brightly in youthful hearts. The noblewoman who ruled there was once admired her gowns sewn with golden thread, her presence commanding respect at every courtly gathering. But grief had twisted her spirit. She had lost someone close, a husband, a child, depending on the tale, and in that loss, something inside her fractured. What remained was not the gentle hand of a protector, but the cold calculation of a predator. To the villagers, she was still a lady of wealth, but to those who entered her gates, she was death disguised in silk. The disappearances began quietly. A farmer's daughter who had gone to fetch water never returned. A weaver's apprentice vanished on her way to market. At first, excuses were made. Perhaps they eloped, perhaps they ran away to the city. But as the list of missing grew, the excuses ran thin. Mothers wailed, fathers sharpened their axes in futile rage, and priests whispered prayers against evil spirits. Yet the castle loomed silent and untouched as though mocking their helplessness. The first rumors spread of how the girls were lured. Some were promised fine clothes, others the chance to serve in the grand hall or even the favor of the noblewoman herself. For poor villagers, these promises were irresistible. A better life, a way out of hunger, perhaps even a glimpse of a world beyond toil. And so they followed willingly, at first unaware that the path into the castle was a one-way journey. Inside, the illusion quickly shattered. The stone corridors were colder than the autumn wind, the heavy iron doors groaning shut behind them like jaws snapping closed. The sweet perfumes of the upper chambers masked the stench of blood and damp earth below. Servants with faces pale as ghosts led the new arrivals down spiral staircases lit by torches that hissed as if protesting their own duty. By the time the girls realized they were prisoners, escape was no longer possible. The noblewoman kept meticulous order in her horrors. Each girl was recorded her name, her village, her age, as if she were nothing more than livestock catalogued before slaughter. Some were tested immediately, subjected to cruel games designed to measure endurance and obedience. Others were left in dark cells, forced to listen to the distant cries of those taken before them. The castle became an echo chamber of despair, every stone absorbing the pain of the innocent. Among the villagers, fear grew unbearable. Some fathers began escorting their daughters everywhere, refusing to let them walk alone even to the well. Others tried to send their girls away to distant relatives. But poverty chained them most could not afford to move or resist. Worse still, soldiers loyal to the noble family patrolled the villages, silencing dissent and ensuring no one dared accuse the mistress of the castle openly. Fear was not only of abduction, it was of punishment for speaking the truth. And so the legend began to twist. Some claimed the lady bathed in blood to preserve her youth, that her beauty remained untouched by time because she fed upon the innocent. Others whispered she was no longer human at all, but a demon cloaked in velvet. Superstition blended with reality until no one knew where rumor ended and fact began. Yet the missing girls were very real, their absence like open wounds in the fabric of every family. But the noblewoman underestimated the resilience of grief. For where fear silences some, it hardens others into action. A father who had lost his daughter began gathering allies in secret. A priest who had heard too many confessions of sorrow started recording names, and whispers began flowing in the opposite direction. Whispers not of terror, but of resistance. The castle once seen as untouchable would soon face the first tremors of defiance. The father's name was Thomas, a stonemason with hands cracked by winter and a gaze that never softened after his daughter vanished. He walked the dusty road between village and chapel every night, memorizing the pattern of hoofprints and cart grooves until he could tell which wheel was missing. A spoke, and one moonless evening, he noticed a new set of tracks, lighter than a wagon, heavier than a lone horse, leading toward a pine grove below the castle hill, where the wind carried the faint rattle of chains and the smell of tallow mixed with damp moss. Thomas brought his findings to Father Adrian, a weary priest whose sermons had begun to tremble at the edges with anger. Together they mapped disappearances on a tattered ledger and found a pattern market: days, fog-heavy dawns, and nights when the castle lit more torches than usual. Adrian whispered that evil thrives not only in darkness, but in routine, and if they could break the rhythm, perhaps they could save the next girl before the gates swallowed her whole. Meanwhile, inside the castle, the noblewoman cultivated a theater of kindness, drifting through corridors with a smile that never reached her eyes, offering sweet pastries to newcomers and silk shawls to shivering shoulders. The gestures were rehearsed, the timing exact, and the girls, starved of kindness, clutched those gifts like lifelines, unaware that each ribbon tied around their wrists was as much a mark of classification as a token of care. One girl, Eliska 16, watchful as a barn cat, noticed the contradictions, how laughter upstairs always gave way to hurried footsteps below, how the same maid who braided her hair lost color in her face whenever a bell rang twice. Eliska counted bells: 1 for food, 2 for evaluation, 3 for the lady herself, and when the third peeled through stone, the hallways seemed to tilt as servants vanished into hidden passages carved where mortar met shadow. Eliska remembered a story her mother told about speaking stones, that old walls could carry words if you pressed your ear to them. One dawn she did, resting her cheek against cold limestone, and heard it a whispering ledger recited by someone with a careful voice listing names, villages, and ages. Eliska tried to etch them into memory, into identity, so they would not dissolve into the gray chalk of the castle's silence. Back in the village, a rumor surfaced of a tradesman who delivered casks to the castle kitchens at odd hours and never looked people in the eye. Thomas trailed the cart through dew-drenched fields, keeping low among hedgerows until the cart stopped near a service postern where a gloved hand passed a pouch of coin to the driver. When the door cracked open, Thomas glimpsed a stairwell spiraling down, lined with sconces that smoked as if they had burned through the night. Father Adrian convened a midnight gathering in the chapel, candles clustered like a small constellation. He spoke gently, asking for specifics instead of rumors, and from that circle of faces came small truths. A girl who'd been promised a seamstress position, a guard who boasted after too much ale, a nurse who begged for herbs to treat fainting fits among guests at the manor. The priest wrote it all, ink scratching like a moth's wings against the parchment, and at the bottom he drew a single line: "We will act at moon's first quarter." Inside the castle, the noblewoman refined her rituals of intimidation without raising her voice. Instead of threats, she employed precision. Open a door a heartbeat early to show she always knew where a girl stood. Set a cup down so quietly that every clink afterward felt like a crime. Interrupt a laugh with a glance until joy seemed dangerous. Fear became architecture, arches of expectation, corridors of dread, a ceiling so low that hope had to crouch to pass under it. When the moon thinned to a silver rind, Tomas and 3 others, Marta the healer, Jaro the miller, and a shepherd boy, nimble as wind, slipped toward the pine grove. Marta carried a bundle of herbs to dull panic and keep minds clear. Jarrow brought a pry bar wrapped in cloth, and the boy clutched a whistle carved from elder wood. They found the disguised path where wagon ruts ended abruptly, scraped away branches, and faced a rough-hewn door half buried in earth. From beyond it came a draft that smelled of mineral chill and old smoke, a breath exhaled by the hill itself. At that same hour, Eliska traced a seam in the wall behind a tapestry of hunting stags and felt a hidden latch shift beneath her palm. The panel loosened with a sigh, revealing a passage lit by a single dying flame. She stepped in pulse drumming in her ears, following the barely there sound of someone reciting names in that same careful voice. And as she turned the corner, she understood the danger and the possibility. At once the castle recorded what it stole. Names, villages, ages, which meant there was a list. And lists can become evidence, and evidence can become salvation if someone lives long enough to carry it out. Eliska crouched in the passage, heart racing as she peered into a narrow chamber where a servant bent over parchment quill, scratching steadily across the page. The servant's lips moved silently, mouthing each girl's name like a prayer or a curse. And Eliska realized this was the ledger of the damned, the proof that every missing daughter had been catalogued stripped of life but not of record. She pressed her palm against her chest to steady her breath, knowing one mistake would mean her own name added to that list. Meanwhile, Tomas and his companions forced the earthen door open with Jarrow's bar. It groaned like a beast waking, releasing a gust of damp air that smelled of mold and rust. They descended into the hillside, torchlight painting jagged shadows across rough stone. The shepherd boy's whistle trembled in his hand, for the tunnel walls bore scratches, fingernail marks desperate and raw that spoke of those who had tried to claw their way out before despair overtook them. Inside the castle, the noblewoman stood in her solar gazing into a mirror framed with tarnished silver. She adjusted the pearls at her throat, though her eyes seemed fixed not on her reflection, but on something behind it, as if she conversed with a ghost only she could see. When a maid entered to announce the arrival of fresh attendants, the lady's smile bloomed too wide, stretching across her face like a crack spreading through marble, unnatural and unyielding. Eliska retreated from the secret chamber, mind burning with questions. Could she steal the ledger? Could she carry it beyond the castle walls? Every path she imagined ended with her body discarded like the others. Yet a small flame inside refused to extinguish. She decided to memorize as much as she could. Names, ages, villages, turning her mind into a living archive, a breathing rebellion against erasure. Down in the hidden tunnel, Marta touched the wall and murmured a prayer, her fingers stained by herbs that masked the stench of rot. They discovered a side corridor, barred by iron, behind which lay scraps of fabric, lace, wool, homespun linen, all tangled together. Tomas recognized a piece of his daughter's apron, and the sight struck him harder than any blade. Rage nearly consumed him, but Marta's steady hand on his arm reminded him that fury must be aimed, not spilled. The noblewoman gathered her servants that evening in the great hall, candles numbering in the hundreds, their flames quivering as though fearful themselves. She spoke of loyalty, of silence, of the eternal rewards of obedience. Her voice never rose yet. Every person present felt the weight of chains in her words. When she dismissed them, none dared move first for fear that hesitation itself would be read as betrayal. Eliska, hiding in a small alcove, overheard fragments of that address. The words eternal reward chilled her, for she knew they meant not heaven but the preservation of the mistress's power. She wondered if the servants were captives too bound by terror rather than chains, and whether their fear might one day turn into revolt if someone could light the spark. Tomas and his group reached a vaulted chamber deep beneath the hill. The ceiling arched low black with soot, and at the center stood a stone basin darkened by stains that needed no explanation. Shackles lined the walls, some empty, some still clasped around bones left to crumble. The shepherd boy gagged, the sound echoing like a sob, and Tomas whispered that they must press forward if there was proof. Here it had to be dragged into daylight, no matter the cost. The noblewoman's eyes, though calm, betrayed a flicker when a guard informed her of strange tracks near the pine grove. She waved her jeweled hand as though dismissing a trivial matter. Yet after the guard left, she summoned 2 hounds, beasts bred for silence as much as for blood. She ordered them loosed into the outer woods, their nostrils flaring, their black shapes sliding through the fog like omens. In the secret passage, Eliska's determination crystallized. She tore a strip from her own dress and scratched initials into it with a shard of broken tile, leaving the cloth wedged between stones. Her way of telling the world, should anyone find it, that not all within these walls had vanished without a trace. It was the first act of defiance, small as a spark. But sparks are what set entire forests ablaze. The hounds prowled through the pine grove, their nails clicking against roots, and their breath steaming in the night air. Tomas froze as one beast sniffed the tunnel entrance, nostrils twitching toward the freshly disturbed soil. Marta scattered a powder of crushed herbs into the breeze, sharp and bitter, and the animals recoiled, sneezing violently. For a moment, the party thought they were safe, but the echo of a distant horn told them the castle knew something was amiss. Eliska crept back toward the dormitory where the other girls slept on straw pallets. She whispered to one, then another, trying to awaken slivers of courage without drawing attention. Most shook their heads in terror. But one, a farmer's daughter named Lyda, gripped her hand, eyes wide with the silent question, "What can we do?" Eliska squeezed back, planting the first fragile root of alliance. At dawn, the noblewoman appeared in the courtyard, draped in crimson velvet that caught the first light like fresh blood. She inspected the line of new arrivals, her gaze pausing on each girl long enough to make them tremble. When she stopped before Lida, Eliska feared discovery, but the lady merely brushed a strand of hair from Lida's face and murmured, "Such delicate skin," before gliding away, leaving behind terror deeper than any wound. Beneath the hill, Thomas and his companions discovered another chamber, this one filled with crates and barrels. Prying one open, they found not grain or wine, but garments. Dozens of them folded with eerie care. Aprons, ribbons, worn shoes. Marta uncovered a rosary, its beads worn smooth by desperate fingers, and whispered that the girls had been stripped not only of freedom but of memory, their belongings hoarded like trophies. Jaro urged them to take evidence, but Tomas insisted they go deeper first. Proof meant nothing without understanding the scale. So they pressed on, torches dimming as damp walls closed in until the tunnel opened into a vast cavern where wooden scaffolds leaned like ribs of a giant skeleton. Chains dangled from beams, swaying as though touched by invisible hands, and beneath them lay stains that even years could not erase. Upstairs, Eliska and Lida were ordered to carry linens to the upper chamber. As they walked the winding stair, Eliska whispered instructions. Watch the guards memorize their patterns. Count the doors. Lida nodded, her fear transmuted into focus. Together they reached a landing where an iron door stood ajar, and through it they glimpsed shelves stacked with parchment rolls, more records perhaps, or letters that could expose the mistress's dealings beyond the castle. In the village, Father Adrian noticed new soldiers patrolling the market square, their armor dull but their eyes sharp. He realized the noblewoman had sensed unrest, and if Tomas and the others were discovered, their punishment would not stop at execution. It would extend to every family that dared whisper against her. Adrian resolved to prepare sanctuary hiding places in the chapel vaults, though he knew wood and stone could only shield against so much. Back in the cavern, Thomas pressed a torch against the wall and revealed markings, symbols scratched into stone circles, within circles, spirals broken by crosses. Marta murmured. They were not Christian, nor any blessing she recognized, but something older, darker. The shepherd boy trembled, swearing he heard whispers echoing within the stone itself, as though the symbols were not merely carved but alive, feeding on fear. The noblewoman descended into her private chamber that evening, where a mirror taller than a man stood draped in black cloth. She pulled it free, revealing not her reflection, but a warped shimmer as though the glass remembered every scream ever uttered in its presence. She touched the surface, and a ripple spread outward, faint as breath on water, before settling back into stillness. When she turned, her expression carried triumph, as if the mirror had answered her unspoken question. Eliska, emboldened by her discovery, vowed that if she could not steal the ledger, she would at least lead one girl to freedom. She whispered to Lita that on the next moonless night they would slip through the hidden seam behind the tapestry and follow the passage out. Lita's lips trembled, but she nodded, clutching the promise as though it were the only weapon she had against despair. The moonless night came cloaked in heavy clouds, smothering even the stars. Eliska and Lita slipped from their pallets while the others pretended to sleep, their eyes squeezed shut against the fear of being seen. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow, a hand reaching every creak of wood, a warning. When they reached the tapestry, Eliska's fingers shook as she found the hidden latch, praying the stone would yield as quietly as it had before. Behind the wall, the passage gaped like a throat, narrow and slick with condensation. The two girls crept along their bare feet, slipping on damp flagstones, the air pressing cold against their skin. They carried no light, fearing discovery and moved by touch alone. Stone ridges beneath palms, sudden dips in the floor, the faint vibration of voices above them. Eliska whispered encouragement, her words trembling but steady enough to keep Lita moving forward. Meanwhile, Tomas and his companions deeper in the cavern stumbled upon a pit carved crudely into the ground. When they lowered a torch, the light revealed bones piled like driftwood, long and short, some still bearing scraps of cloth. Marta covered her mouth, her herbs unable to mask the stench of decay. Tomas gripped the pit's edge until his knuckles whitened and swore aloud that if he left this place alive, he would see the castle burn. In the castle above, the noblewoman feasted with her closest retainers. Wine poured like rivers, meat roasted over spits dripped fat into the fire, and laughter rang false beneath the vaulted ceiling. Yet, every so often, her eyes darted to the door as though she knew a threat approached, as though her finely tuned instincts had scented rebellion in the air. When the laughter faltered, she raised her goblet high and declared to silence the finest servant of all. Eliska and Lita reached a fork in the passage. One tunnel sloped upward toward faint air, another downward into silence. Eliska chose the incline, guiding Lita carefully, but before they had climbed far, a lantern flickered ahead, one of the hound's keepers patrolling the hidden routes. The girls pressed flat against the wall, hearts pounding as the glow passed so close they could smell the tang of oil and sweat their breath held until the darkness returned. Tomas and the others pressed further, their torches weakening. The shepherd boy suddenly stumbled, his whistle clattering against stone. The sound echoed, bouncing along the cavern walls like a scream, and almost at once they heard the distant barking of the hounds. Jarro cursed under his breath, urging them to hurry, but Tomas shook his head. If they ran blindly, they would be caught in the maze. They needed cunning, not speed, if they were to escape. In the village, Father Adrian knelt before the chapel altar, whispering prayers, not just for the missing, but for the living who risked themselves to uncover the truth. Outside, soldiers marched heavier than before, their boots pounding like war drums. The villagers huddled in their homes, shutters barred, but even silence betrayed them, every unlit window marked by soldiers as guilt, every prayer recited too softly, mistaken for plotting. Eliska and Lita finally reached a grated opening that overlooked the pine grove. The night air rushed in cool and sharp with the scent of resin. Lita began to sob softly at the taste of freedom, but Eliska clamped a hand over her mouth. Below, two dark shapes prowled the hounds, circling their red eyes, glinting in the torchlight carried by a guard. The outside was close, but death was closer, waiting with bared teeth. In the cavern, Tomas pressed his torch to one of the symbols carved in stone, and to his horror, the flame bent inward, drawn unnaturally as though the mark consumed the fire itself. Marta pulled him back, shouting that the walls themselves had been fed by blood soaked until stone remembered. The shepherd boy whispered that the cavern was not just a prison but a shrine, and the girls were not only victims but offerings. Above them all in her private chamber, the noblewoman opened her ledger and ran her fingers down the list of names, pausing at Aliska's, circling it with a quill dipped in crimson ink. She smiled faintly, as though she knew her prey was moving through the passages at that very moment. Then she closed the book, extinguished her candle, and whispered into the dark. "None leave my house alive." The grated opening above the pine grove offered a cruel promise, freedom within reach, yet guarded by hounds that prowled the underbrush like shadows given teeth. Aliska pulled Lita back, whispering that they must wait, though every heartbeat felt like thunder in the silence. The torchlight below swayed, fading into the fog, and for a fleeting moment, hope flickered that the path might open. Deep in the cavern, Thomas decided they could not leave empty-handed. He tore a strip from his cloak and wrapped the rosary scraps of cloth and a lock of hair found near the pit of bones. These tokens, though drenched in sorrow, would serve as undeniable proof. Jarro grumbled that they risked too much, but Tomas's jaw set firm without evidence. Their words would be dismissed as superstition, and the dead would remain nameless. Upstairs, the noblewoman's mirror rippled again, as though stirred by invisible hands. She gazed into its depths, and this time she saw flashes, villagers with torches, a chapel crowded with whispers, and her own face pale and gaunt as if drained of its power. Anger flickered across her features, and she ordered her guards to double patrols, her voice sharp enough to slice the silence in two. Aliska and Lita crawled back into the passage, deciding to search for another way. The tunnel twisted and dipped, leading them toward a faint hum, a vibration that grew louder with each step until it became the murmur of voices. Peering through a crack in the stone, they saw the noblewoman's feast hall. Below her guests, laughing with forced cheer, while behind them servants carried platters lined not with food but with bowls of something darker, thicker, that steamed faintly in the candlelight. Tomas and his companions pressed onward, but the barking of the hounds grew louder. They doused one torch, moving in near darkness, guided only by Marta's whispered prayers. The shepherd boy blew his whistle, once sharp and piercing, startling the beasts and scattering their approach for a moment. It bought them time, but Tomas knew the echo of that sound would carry up into the castle. The noblewoman's suspicion grew. She summoned her most trusted guard, a scarred veteran named Varric, and ordered him to search every hidden passage. "There is a rat in my walls," she said coldly, "and I will hear its death cry before dawn." Varric bowed, his expression grim, for he knew the castle's secrets better than any servant, and he also knew that if he failed, his own name might join the ledger. Aliska, realizing they could not linger, led Lita back to the seam near the tapestry. As they crept along, they passed another recess in the stone, and there, half hidden beneath debris, lay scraps of parchment pages torn from the ledger, perhaps discarded drafts. Aliska clutched them, heart surging with hope, for now she carried proof in her hands, not just in her memory. In the cavern, Marta noticed a current of air brushing across her cheek. Following it, they discovered a fissure that opened upward, jagged and narrow. If widened, it might lead to the forest above. Jarro jammed his pry bar into the stone, straining, while Tomas steadied the torch. The rock groaned, dust showering down, and with each crack, the sound of the hounds drew nearer, their growls reverberating like thunder. Above, Father Adrian heard the faint cry of the shepherd's whistle carried on the night wind. He knew at once that Tomas was in peril, and he gathered the bravest villagers, arming them with whatever they could carry: pitchforks, axes, sickles. Though fear clung to them, Adrian's voice cut through. "If we wait, our daughters die. Tonight, we rise." The villagers nodded, their silence transformed into resolve. The noblewoman stood at her balcony, eyes scanning the dark horizon. She felt the unrest before she saw it, the faint glow of torches gathering in the village below. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face, quickly masked by a smile that was sharper than any blade. "Let them come," she whispered. "The walls have thirsted too long." The villagers moved as a single tide, their torches glowing like stars torn from the heavens and brought to earth. The clang of their tools and the murmur of their anger rolled up the hill toward the castle. each step a defiance against centuries of silence. Father Adrian marched at the front, his crucifix gleaming in the firelight, his voice steady as he recited psalms, though his heart thundered with the knowledge that not all of them would return alive. Inside the cavern, Thomas and his companions hacked at the fissure until a crack yawned wide enough for the shepherd boy to squeeze through. He scrambled upward, scraping his hands bloody until the cool kiss of night air met his skin. With trembling relief, he blew his whistle, twice the signal of survival. Thomas and Jaro followed, hauling Marta last, and together they tumbled into the forest, clutching their bundle of evidence as if it were the very soul of the dead. Eliska and Lida, clutching their scraps of parchment, made their move at the same time. They slipped from the tapestry passage into the hall, darting between shadows as guards thundered past in search of intruders. Every corner seemed alive with menace, yet adrenaline lent them wings. When they reached the servant's stair, Eliska felt her courage flare. Each step upward was a heartbeat closer to freedom, each breath proof that she had not yet joined the ledger of the lost. The noblewoman descended into the great hall, her crimson gown trailing like spilled blood, her presence halting every servant mid-step. She raised her hand, and silence fell heavy as stone. "They come for me," she said softly, almost tenderly, "but they will find only despair." Her eyes glittered as she ordered her guards to seal the gates and prepare boiling oil, her cruelty cloaked in the language of command. At the edge of the forest, Tomas's group stumbled upon the villagers advancing. Father Adrian grasped Tomas's shoulders, his relief fierce, and together they displayed the bloodied rosary, the torn garments, the scraps of proof. The crowd gasped, fury kindling brighter than their torches. Mothers wept, fathers roared oaths, and the mob surged forward, no longer bound by fear but by righteous rage. Eliska and Lida reached a narrow window in an unused chamber, its shutters rotted and weak. With desperate strength, they forced it open, shards of wood splintering in their hands. Outside, the forest stretched vast and dark, alive with the glow of torches in the distance. Eliska whispered, "We can make it." And for the first time, Lida's lips curled into something like a smile, though it trembled with both terror and hope. The noblewoman stood at the balcony once more, watching the villagers swarm the hillside like an army of ants. She clutched her ledger, pressing it against her chest as though it were a shield, then raised it high for all to see. "You think me guilty," she called into the night, her voice carrying unnaturally far. "But I am eternal, and my name will never be erased." The villagers answered not with words, but with a roar of fury, their torches blazing brighter against the black. Inside the castle, Varric the guard cornered Eliska and Lida as they slipped into the corridor. His sword glinted his scarred face, unreadable. For a moment, Eliska thought all was lost, but then Varric glanced at the parchment in her hands and his jaw tightened. Instead of striking, he hissed, "Run," and stepped aside his silence, an act of rebellion that would cost him his life. The girls fled, their feet barely touching the stone. The villagers stormed the outer gates, rams crashing against iron, sparks flying as chains snapped. Soldiers poured boiling oil from the ramparts, screams tearing into the night, but rage made the peasants unstoppable. They climbed ladders, hacked through doors, their fury a storm against which no wall could stand. The air filled with smoke and fire, the castle's silhouette wreathed in a burning halo. At last, Tomas and Father Adrian forced their way into the great hall where the noblewoman stood defiantly, the ledger clutched like scripture. She hissed curses, her voice rising into a shriek as villagers swarmed around her. In the chaos, Eliska appeared, thrusting the torn pages into Adrian's hands, proof undeniable. The priest raised them high, and the crowd howled with triumph. The noblewoman was seized, her screams echoing as she was dragged toward the courtyard. And though justice came, the castle's stones would forever remember the cries of the innocent, carrying them into legend as a warning. Silence feeds monsters, but voices united can tear them down.